Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live chat. I'm so excited to be joining you again, like I do almost every Thursday at 3 p.m. Central, talking about quilting in general. And right now we're right in the middle, smack dab in the middle of the Fabulous Feathers Free Motion Challenge. And so if you're not sure what I'm talking about, be sure to check out my previous live chats because it's a video series where we're working through a panel, learning how to quilt feathers in all different areas of our quilts. And this week's tutorial that came out on Tuesday was the feather motif. And so I think those of you that might have struggled with the feather meander might like it better because it's a little bit more constrained. Is everything okay? Okay, it's a little bit more constrained. It's a little bit less make it up as you go. So as I plan out the videos, I try to like alternate between, the designs that are like, just wing it and have fun, which I like, and the designs that are a little bit more like, okay, here's the steps how to do it. So the good news is if you didn't like the feather meander, you might like the motifs. What I love about feather motifs is it's such an easy way to give the quilting a custom look. And sometimes, in some situations, it's easier than actually quilting a regular feather. If you think about bigger areas, maybe I don't want to try to quilt this feather in this, continuous area. Quilting a self-contained motif that fits my throat space is going to be a lot easier. So back in the day when I would quilt for customers, sometimes I'd throw a motif on there and tell them that I didn't charge them extra for the custom quilting, even though it was a little bit easier than what I had planned on doing before. A couple things about motifs, and then we're going to jump right into the pictures. I have some quilted samples to show you, examples of where you can put them on your quilts. In this video tutorial, I talked a lot about marking out registration lines or kind of marking out the design. When you're starting out quilting, you might feel the need to mark out the whole motif, and that's absolutely fine. You got to do whatever you will do. But as you progress through your skill level and get a little bit more comfortable, you can mark less and less of your design. It just makes it a little bit easier when it comes to removing the designs. I did a lot with the Basic 8 stencil to kind of mark those registration lines. This is my favorite way of marking, just to have a general registration. This is where I want the center to be. This is how I want it to flow, and then just kind of winging it from there. But again, you can definitely mark out as much as you want. Make it comfortable for you. I don't want you freaking out while you're quilting. This is supposed to be fun. So when you're working through this, definitely feel like you can mark it out. Now, I get on the video link about a half an hour before we go live, and we're text chat and type chat with people that are on there. So join us if you're ever available. And there were a couple questions about getting the water-soluble marker out. So I love the Mark Be Gone, the blue water-soluble marker. I've just always used it, so I'm always going to stick with it. And some people said like, oh, I'm having trouble with it coming off. So just want to talk about that for just a quick moment. After I quilt my design, even if I'm still working on the quilt, I'll just spray it with water once I'm done with that area so that it can start being removed. Sometimes it takes a couple of times to get it off of there depending on how heavily I marked it. And when you spray it, you want to get it pretty saturated, because if you just put a little bit of water, it will kind of run and it will still be there. In fact, if you look super close at the pictures of the photo samples of my quilted sample, you can still see some of those faint lines because I didn't leave quite enough time to spray it before I took pictures. Anyway, but it will come out, so you can definitely have fun with that. But that's just an aside, just a little bonus there. All right, so let's talk through our motifs and our pictures. I had so much fun kind of digging back through customer quilts that I would have quilted a long time ago and finding examples of where you would use motifs and why, because I think it's so important to know where would you actually use this. I think it's kind of like my persuasive argument to make you love the designs as much as I do. When we started in the video, I kind of talked about the elements of a motif. Now, this is just something to me. I don't know that this is actually like, the rules of it, but for me, most motifs consist of the center, and that's where everything kind of radiates from. The motif being a self-contained design, it has a clear start and stop. It doesn't go on continuously. It just adds that pretty look, and I love to use it in a lot of different areas. So it's going to start with the center, and this center can be whatever you want it to be. It could be round, it could be pointy, you can put stuff inside of it, you can leave it unquilted. We're going to see some quilted examples of this. Usually, depending on how big it is whether or not I'll fill it in with something. Then we have our sides of our motif, or the rest of the design. And with this particular one, with the feather motif, I have those feathers kind of radiating from the center, and one thing I want to just kind of reiterate so much, I probably can't say this too much. It doesn't matter if it's perfectly the same on both sides. I'm aiming for symmetrical. That's it. So if my line curls down over here, I want the same to curl down over there. It's that symmetry is going to make it look perfect, even if it's not. I promise you, it's a fun trick. So don't worry about the petals being the same number on each side, or even that it's exactly the same, height or whatever. If it's symmetrical, it's going to look fine. So once we kind of got those elements there, if you wanted, you could mark those out ahead of time, and you can kind of see the subtle chalk line from my basic 8 and then marking out those guidelines. Again, I kind of marked out a lot of the feathers in the video so you can see how it goes together before we get to the quilting, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. All right, so then once we kind of learned the elements and we kind of saw what to do, then we played around with actually quilting it. And so I showed how to do the feather motif with the basic feather technique, and that's the one where we don't have any traveling. It goes a little bit faster. I don't do this one a whole lot because if I'm going to do a motif, I might do the custom feather motif because that's my favorite. But this would be a great option for anybody that's nervous about feathers and just wants to work on the motif without worrying about that traveling, or maybe it's in a busier fabric and you can't quite see it. I mean, that would be a great option because it's a little bit quicker. But then we talked about the custom feather motif. And again, that custom feather is just what I call the feather that has that little bit of backtracking. Oh, it just looks so pretty and has a nice look. One thing I want to point out in the panel, if you're quilting along with me on the panel and you bought the coordinating thread collection, I want to encourage you to maybe quilt your motifs in contrasting colors. So even though it's light gray, I quilted 2 of the corners with the motifs in pink lemonade and the opposite 2 in the haze, and then filled in around it with the light gray thread. So you can kind of see there. It gives you that subtle pop of color, but since it's pretty similar in value, it's not too much of a dramatic color difference there. Of course, up to you. Then I threw in, for funsies, a half motif. And if you did the previous feathers challenge way back when, challenge number 2, I called these mini motifs. We quilted them in a smaller area. But this is a really great way to draw attention to a particular area of your block. And if you notice, since it's along the edge of the block, I don't have to break thread to start a new motif. I can just travel over there and go right into it. Whereas on the other motifs, I'm going to start a new line of quilting. I have to break thread and start a new line. And if you've watched any of my videos, you know I don't love that, but I'll definitely do it for a motif because I want to make sure it's exactly where I want it. But this is a great option for smaller blocks, or if you have, and we'll see some examples of this, but also if you want to be able to quilt your motif and move on without breaking thread. Maybe a time is an issue. You decided to start that last minute gift and you needed to kind of get it done. All right, so let's look at some examples, and we're going to start with the half motif because we're just right there. This was a fun quilt I actually did for Judy Niemeyer. I don't remember the name of it. This is the only detailed picture I have. But that little, half motif, again, it's just a great way to draw attention to the blocks. Those lines are all coming down there. And I use the quilting to kind of break up the negative space and create that shape that I wanted to quilt. So even though that half motif tends to be smaller, I don't quilt it very large, I can use the quilting to take that big area and kind of knock it down a little bit. And then you can almost see at the top, this is a motif at the very top, kind of wrapping around following the edge there. So, oh, here we go, better picture. So when you're thinking of where to put motifs on your quilt, use your imagination. There's really nowhere that's a bad place for it as long as there's enough room. So it's not something I'm going to try to fit into a really small area because that's going to be too much of a pain. But if I have enough room, a motif is going to be a great option. It's also great for pieced blocks. So these pictures are kind of older. These are quilts I did several years ago, and so the pictures aren't as great. But in that pink, you can see that half motif following the shape of that block. So if you have a block that just happens to fit well, a triangle-shaped block or a block like this, it's going to help draw attention to that center bit and really be nice and fun and easy to quilt. And then in the purple, it doesn't have to be a feather motif. We're going to see here in a second, and so it's a great option for blocks. Again, are you always going to quilt a diamond-shaped block? Probably not, but if you come across those blocks where it happens to work, by all means, go ahead. It's a lot of fun to use it there. And it just so happened that I took a video. I found this when I was going through all my pictures, so this is me quilting that other motifs. So I have the center, I'm on my long arm, and then I'm going to do one side and then the other. And so again, having all those lines come back to that one point is really going to help draw attention to it. And really, whatever shape you work with, it doesn't matter. You know the rest. Just make sure you fill in the area as much as possible. Now, this does have a little bit of traveling as I get back to the center and then move on to the other side. But again, it's going to be a useful design for those blocks that maybe aren't your typical kind of blocks. So the half motif is a great stepping point if you're nervous about quilting motifs, because you can definitely play with them in busier fabrics and kind of get comfortable with them. It's going to be very, very helpful. All right, now as we work on motifs, I had a very, very difficult time narrowing it down to the ones I showed you, because I was like, oh, I want to show them all the motifs. I'm working on a bonus video with motif variations. Fingers crossed I can get it done. So I'm planning on it, but I want to show you how you can change up the motifs to fit whatever you're working on. If you think about those basic elements, we just need a center and some sides, and we can change those up in any way. So for the most part in the challenge, we kind of quilted them kind of straight. They're a little maybe curved down, but you can really bend those sides. They can go out at any angle. And so if you're working on larger borders, this is a perfect element for border corners or for areas of your quilt that are a weird angle, because you can just make those sides go wherever you need them to go. And I did find some good examples of that. So in this example, I have a quilt, a fairly big border. You know what happens, you make the quilt and it's, twin size, but you have a king size bed. So you start putting big borders on your quilts. This is a great way to add that kind of custom look to the corner without having to connect them. And we're going to talk about quilting all the way around and how you connect your feathers. That's going to be the very last video, but this is a great way to make it look custom without having to think about how you're going to eventually hook them back together. When you're quilting your motifs, you can make them as long as you'd like. So in the area that we were filling in on the challenge, it was kind of a smaller block just to make it less, intimidating, a little bit, no big deal. But as you're quilting, you can make them as long as you want to, depending on the area that you're working on. And if you look at this motif, can you tell that the horizontal is longer than the vertical? Well, there's a great reason for that. I quilted this on my long arm, and it's a lot easier to quilt long horizontal than vertical. So I quilted one side longer and the other side shorter. That doesn't really work, does it? Because you're like, it's not symmetrical. But if I do all four of them like that, then it is symmetrical. So you can really kind of play around with the design elements there and make it fit your preferences. I cannot say that enough, because you want to be able to make it easy on yourself. Quilting is fun. It's not a punishment. One thing I did forget to reiterate, if you have any questions, be sure to type them out. Jessica's here watching and writing them down. So if I mention something you have a question about, I'd be glad to help you answer it. All right, how about this? This was a fun quilt. It's a huppah. It was for Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts. And so she had me quilt this thing that they got married under. And I'm like, what do you do with a hexagon shaped quilt, right? Like, I love those kind of challenges. And we're going to see this again in next week's video when we talk about quilting irregular areas. But this is the whole huppah. But if you look along the top, again, I know it's not the best picture, but in that white kind of border, you can see those motifs that I quilted in there. Again, they're not at a 90-degree angle, but it's perfect because that motif can just fit that area that I have, and I don't have to worry about trying to hook them together. So bigger areas, perfect for motifs, or especially bigger borders and corners, and really get comfortable with making them go in all different directions. Or you can quilt them straight out like I did here. So again, you can go around the corner or straight for, like, think again, bigger borders or bigger pieces of blocks. And this quilt was the perfect example of that technique. So I'm so sorry, I don't remember who pieced this. It was a customer quilt from a long time ago, but such big areas of solid fabric. I mean, that's a little scary sometimes because you're like, ooh. But motifs I knew would be the perfect option. So in that darker blue border, those are actually motifs that kind of just fill in the area, and then centering them on that block on point, right? So where you have those white blocks, I have those motifs kind of centered, just helps draw attention to that area and makes it look really nice. And here's a little bit of a closer look. So we see those elements, right? We have the center, we have the spine, and then those petals, and they're fitting the space perfectly. So sometimes your motif will have gaps around it that you can fill in, or other times you can make it fit the space perfectly. It's really it's really up to you and what you're working on. And then even the motif that's in the red, so it's kind of hard to see. Again, these are older pictures, not the best. But this motif that I quilted kind of comes out. Here's my spine and my center, but I'm only quilting feathers along one side of it because I love when you rotate it on all four sides, it kind of creates that secondary effect. So don't feel like you have to feather both sides of your spine, because you don't have to. And I have some other examples of that here in a second. And this is just for fun, because who doesn't love the picture of the back of the quilt? All that different thread colors showing up. A lot of fun. That quilt took a while to quilt, but I was so happy when it was done, like with how it turned out. All right, and then another big quilt, another motif, really play around with the shape of your spine. So instead of quilting your center and your sides, you can quilt your center, and that can then act as the spine of your feather. So this is going to be great for blocks, bigger blocks, or really oddly shaped blocks that you want to draw attention to. Any way you want to quilt those petals or those spines, those feathers, it's a really fun way to come up with a lot of variations. And a good challenge to do would be to experiment with, how many different ways can I quilt a motif in a particular area. You can see there's a lot going on here. There's pebbles inside. There's a different thing inside the motif. This was a really large block, and I had a lot of space to fill it in. But definitely have fun with the placement of it. And like that shows right there, you can make so many different variations. This is kind of backs out a little bit for you so you can see the whole quilt. And look at those borders. They are huge. And we're going to talk about sectioning off your feathers next week. So we'll see this quilt again as well. But if you look in the halfway mark of the borders, you can see another motif in there. And so just, again, making my center, making my spine, and then quilting it a little bit different. Really fun way to take the same basic technique and quilt it in a lot of different ways. And there's actually motifs in the big red corners too. You just can't really see them very well. So even on the same quilt, changing it up, using a bunch of different motifs is a lot of fun. Another way that I had fun using motifs is in this Bargello quilt. So I kind of loved the look of the colors, which usually Bargellos have that neat look. And so in each of the sections, I quilted a feather motif, and you can kind of see it in there, maybe where that red and orange come together. So it doesn't necessarily even have to be background space. I know sometimes we think, oh, I got to have a quilt with a lot of big negative space areas, but it can go over your blocks as well. So really look to where you can put in those motifs, because if you're determined, you can fit them in some places. Now, when we're talking about motifs, the thing I want to point out is you don't have to quilt feathers. You can do anything. In this particular example, I did a scroll kind of motif where I quilted these kind of scroll shapes that come out, but didn't add any feathers around them. This was one of the very, very early quilts I did for Tula Pink a long time ago. So it's kind of crazy. My baby was a baby at the time, and now she's 12. So it's kind of crazy how long ago that was. But when you're looking at your motifs, if you're like, I love the look of motifs, but I don't love feathers, then take the feathers out. Make it easy for yourself. And here, I just kind of had that cool kind of scroll effect. And then all those pebbles to make them pop. And by the time I got done with that corner, I was pretty tired of pebbles for sure. But another example of maybe a motif that you wouldn't necessarily think of would be kind of like a scroll kind of thing. And here I have that shape, but it's kind of rotating around. And here's a little bit closer of it. And again, this is for Tula Pink quilt as well. So it doesn't have a center, and it kind of, but it still extends out. It doesn't have that center like element, but it has the four of them kind of coming out. So you can play around with the arrangement of it and leave that center out altogether. The reason I kind of say it's an element is because it is present in most of the motifs that I personally quilt, and it just gives you a good visual on where to go, where to come back to, but you don't have to have a center to it. All right, so this is kind of a more muted example of that red and white quilt. So I quilted my center, I quilted the really big top and a really tiny bottom, and then I just added petals around the outside of it. So again, you can make the center and the spine the same, and again, this will be perfect for those larger blocks or those irregular shapes. Or just like that red and white quilt, if it's in the center, maybe I want to draw attention to the center of it, rotate it, create some really cool effects. This was a perfect quilt for that kind of thing. I quilted it, sorry, again, I can't remember the name of the customer I quilted this for. It was for a book, I do remember that. But these blocks were really cool, spiky kind of scallops, but what the heck are you supposed to quilt in those big blocks to draw attention to them? And eventually I settled on a motif just like that. A different filler, it's a different shape and size, but the same basic idea. So you can definitely use those in bigger blocks as well. Here's a little bit closer up. And you know how this goes, right? I'm going to quilt the center first. I'm going to add any embellishments while I'm there, add feathers on one side, echo back, and then do the other. So same arrangement, or same way of doing it, just a different arrangement of the elements. All right, for those of you that want a little bit more of a challenge, you can add several spines to your motif. Now this is going to be for much bigger areas. This is going to be a much more thread heavy ornate element, but man, it looks really pretty. And so basically what I'm doing is instead of quilting one spine, I'm quilting two and then adding my feathers around it. It's a little bit trickier in getting around and kind of figuring out where you need to go next, but you know the trick, right? We're just going to echo, 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 echo until we get where we need to go. So just like you've seen, we can make these super ornate. Now in the very first or second video, when we did the blocks, feathers in the quilt blocks, we saw a lot of variations, and you can use any of those variations with the motif idea. So remember those wonky feathers? Perfect, you can use wonky feathers in your motif. So it doesn't have to be, you know, formal and elegant. It can be fun and funky and whimsical. So definitely have fun creating different elements just by changing up the spine, the center, or the petals. Now, one design I didn't get a chance to show in the tutorial, this is one I quilted, was an example of putting petals on just one side of the spine. And so here's a little bit of a closer look, but it also illustrates how thread heavy this design is in the center. There's a lot of thread coming into that area. And I know I say this a lot, but I just have to reiterate, when I'm filming, I use a contrasting thread color so you can see what I'm doing. It is not going to be a helpful tutorial if you cannot see my quilting. This is definitely not something I would necessarily do on a quilt, right? I don't want that thread buildup to detract from the pretty elements of the motif. So just know that using a thread color that matches or is the same value, for instance, light gray or light pink, is going to give you the best effect for that. Now, before I answer your questions, Jessica's been writing some down. I could see her over there. If you're quilting along with me on the challenge panel and I didn't go over that first inner gray border, if you want to quilt it like I did, I just did a half feather technique here where I'm just quilting along the spine, or you're quilting along one side of that area like it's the spine and quilting my petals off of there. It's a really fun way to fill in those 2-inch borders. We did this in the Borders and Backgrounds Challenge, so you can check that out if you want to do that yourself. And I kind of played around with color placement as well on the thread. I didn't really put this in the handouts, but wherever, like, if it was orange block right there, I used the orange thread. So you can change up the thread colors as you go if you want a little bit more of a challenge. But not everybody loves changing thread colors as much as I do, so I totally understand if you don't want to do that. All right, so that's kind of the examples of what we've been going through, and I hope that it was inspiring and not overwhelming. I don't want to make you think, oh great, I can't do that. But I want you to see how many different ways you can really use these designs. And so we have some questions coming up. Good. I love being able to answer your questions live because I think that's what takes this video series from just being a tutorial to like an interactive class. Okay, sometimes my feathers change directions, not sure how I get disoriented. If you're talking about the individual petals, like maybe your petals are going one way and next thing you know they're facing the opposite way, it could be that you're not merging your petals into the spine. My hand movements is not going to really help you here, but instead of that half heart shape, if you start putting it into the spine, next thing you know you're going the opposite direction. And that was in the troubleshooting petals or troubleshooting feathers in the first video. Try that and see if that helps, if that's exactly what you're talking about. If you're talking about as you're quilting your motif and it changes direction, maybe marking out the first part of the feather will help you out, the first set of petals, just to kind of get you going, or even the first petal or two, just to kind of get into that movement. I promise, after you practice a little bit, it will definitely click. So try not to get discouraged. Do I have a quilt as you go motif or a book about motifs? I do not. So that's a good idea because I could really come up with some great motifs. I'll have to put a pin in that. I haven't wrote a book in a long time. I've really enjoyed the more video tutorials and doing the quilting diagrams and tip sheets. But I think maybe a little booklet, like quilt as you go, like, or not, motifs, and then kind of creating your own. I'm gonna save that question. I'm gonna put it over here in my pile of things to do. It's gonna be on the list. And then the last question that came up, what marking tool do I use? I like the Pounce pads for the stencils. So they come in blue, white, and pink. Those are great for quickly marking the registration lines of the designs with line stencils or any stencils that you might have. I use that for those kinds of stencils. And then if I'm marking out like individual things, I like the Mark Be Gone water soluble pen or the Ultimate marking pencil. I think I have it here. So this is cool. If it's going to be like on a darker fabric, I'll use this. It's made up of Pounce chalk, but it's in a more solid form. So it kind of gives me that white marking line. And we'll see this when we talk about quilting border corners, because that's blue on the quilt and you can't see the blue markings. Ultimately though, it doesn't matter what marking tool you use as long as you are comfortable with it. And I know there's a lot of great products on the market, but those are the ones I use. And again, it's just my opinion. Before I sign off and let you all go, I want to talk a little bit about next week, but I want to also say I know this is a busy time of year and not everybody is caught up on the challenge or has even started. There's no pressure, no judgment. Okay, so try not to feel like, oh, I'll never catch up now. The thing is, these videos will stay on my YouTube channel whenever you're ready for them. And then as I go through the live chats, you can ask questions about previous challenges as well. I'm definitely glad to help. I think our quilting should be our therapy, obviously, our happy place. It shouldn't be something that we feel bad about. So just do what you can when you can, and if you can't, no big deal. I know that it's definitely a busy time. Now, next week, I am so excited about next week's tutorial because we're going to talk about filling in irregularly shaped areas with feathers. You know, when I do a class or a challenge, all the elements are perfect for what I'm teaching, but what happens when you come across a quilt with those areas that aren't quite right? I'm going to share 3 different techniques on how to handle that, including how to make your feathers look like they're going behind elements of your quilt. I know that's something that people have been asking for on the type chat or leaving comments, so I cannot wait to show you how I do that and how you can make some really cool effects. And of course, I'll be back with a live chat that next Thursday to talk over and answer your questions live. If you're not watching this live, no worries. You can still leave your questions in the comments section. I get on there from time to time and answer them to check on everything, see how you're going, and other quilters will chime in on there as well. So we definitely want to make sure that you have everything you need to be successful with the designs that we're learning. Well, I hope everybody has a great and happy week, and I will see you next Tuesday with the next video in our challenge. Bye, everybody, and happy quilting.